The envelope fell out like it had been waiting, for years, maybe decades, tucked behind a recipe for lemon pie she never baked, from a life she barely remembered. It hit the floor with a hush, the kind that makes your heart pause before your hand moves. "To the girl I used to be," it said in her own handwriting, but softer, younger, untouched by betrayal. Claire stared at it as the storm raged outside, the kind of rain that taps against the windows like it's trying to come in. She hadn't planned to cry. She hadn't planned to remember. But the letter was there, and so was everything she'd tried to forget. The man who never showed up, the silence she called strength, the birthday cake she threw away untouched. She picked up a pen, not to rewrite history, but to ask forgiveness. Would you? Could you? Forgive yourself after all these years? Claire lives in a small town where the ocean is never far, and the nights are always a little colder than memory allows. Her house sits on a quiet street lined with hydrangeas that bloom in June and wilt by August, like most of the things she once believed would last. At 48, she manages the local library, a space filled with paperbacks and silence, where teenagers whisper dreams between bookshelves and old men reread the same mysteries out of habit, not suspense. Her life is soft around the edges, morning coffee at the same window seat, evenings marked by the sound of a worn-out radio that still plays jazz from the 90s. She doesn't mind the quiet. It's the questions that make the silence loud. In the corner of her study is a wooden desk, scratched by time and grief. Inside it, a box of letters she never mailed, some to men she once loved, some to people who never stayed long enough to know her middle name. But most were addressed to a girl she used to be, a girl who believed that staying was strength and sacrificing meant love. Claire isn't bitter. She's just tired of pretending she forgot. Her daughter, Lena, now 26 and living 2 states away, once asked during a phone call, "Mom, how did you become so calm?" Claire had smiled, said nothing, because the truth was, she hadn't. She had just grown better at hiding the thunder. This is not a story about regret. It's about the quiet bravery of facing your own reflection, not in the mirror, but in memory. In the words you didn't say, in the love you didn't protect, in the self you didn't forgive. She writes because that girl, 25, hopeful, bruised, deserves a letter. Deserves to know she mattered, even when she forgot how to. And maybe you, reading this, have a version of yourself still waiting for a reply too. If you could speak to her, what would you say? It started with a drawer that stuck. Claire hadn't opened that side of the desk in years, partly because the wood had warped and partly because she no longer believed in unearthing things better left undisturbed. But that evening, as the kettle hummed and rain kissed the windows like a familiar stranger, she pulled anyway. A soft tug, then a sharp breath, and the drawer surrendered. Inside was a tangle of yellowed paper, ribbon ends, and a leather-bound journal, her old one. The cover was creased, the spine almost broken, but it still smelled faintly of ink and lavender, a scent from another decade. She sat down before she even realized she'd done so. Flipping through the pages felt like trespassing. Her younger self had written like she believed someone would one day read it. Pages spilled over with heartbreak and declarations, moments she thought would end her, and others she swore would save her. There were entries about David, about the birthday he forgot, about how she smiled through it anyway, told herself it wasn't a big deal as she scraped uneaten cake into the bin. But one page stopped her cold. It was dated exactly 23 years ago. August 11th. The same day the envelope had been written, the same handwriting, the same girl, just more raw. It said in slanted script, "If you're reading this, it means you survived. But tell me, did we ever learn to leave?" Claire traced the words with her fingertip. Her throat tightened. She hadn't. Not really. She stayed too long in places that didn't want her, said yes when she wanted to scream no, smiled to avoid confrontation, Loved like it was a debt to be paid in full, before she ever asked to be loved back. Her silence had always looked like strength from the outside, but inside it was a storm she kept bottled and labeled, fine. She put the journal down, went to the kitchen, turned off the kettle she had forgotten was boiling. Then, slowly, as though afraid of what it might cost her, she took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not to David, not to Lena, not to Grace or any name that still carried history. This time, she wrote to herself, the girl who waited in birthday dresses, the girl who whispered, "It's okay," one too many times, the girl who thought being chosen meant she was worthy. Tonight, Claire was writing her back. The pen moved slower than it used to. Her handwriting had changed over the years, no longer curved and hopeful, but tighter, steadier, like someone who had learned to measure every word before letting it out. Still, Claire wrote without pause, letting memory take the lead. She started with something simple. Dear you. Then hesitated. How do you address a version of yourself who still thought love was a test she needed to pass? The page filled slowly, line by line, not with answers, but with apologies. She wrote about the day David asked her to cancel her birthday plans because he was too tired from work, and how she smiled and said, "Of course," then spent the evening alone, watching the wax melt off a candle she never lit. She had baked her own cake that year, chocolate, his favorite, not because she wanted to, but because she thought if she did everything right, maybe one day he'd stay. But the letter wasn't about David. It was about the girl who kept loving him anyway. Claire wrote about the Sunday mornings they used to spend in silence. Her cooking, him reading, neither saying the things that mattered. And how she convinced herself that quiet meant peace, not distance. She remembered one morning he left for a quick errand and didn't return until dusk. No explanation, no apology. She didn't ask. She was too afraid of the answer. That was the day she stopped singing while she cooked. There was a paragraph she didn't write but thought over and over. You deserved better. You deserved someone who saw you, not someone who kept you waiting. Then, near the bottom of the second page, her pen slowed again. There had been someone else. It was brief, subtle, almost like a subplot in a story no one ever finished. His name was Matthew, one of Lena's teachers from an after-school art program. Claire had met him on a rainy afternoon when Lena forgot her sketch pad, and he had driven it to the library himself. They spoke for exactly 13 minutes, about books, about coffee, about how Maine's coast in autumn felt like the edge of the world but quieter. She never told anyone about that afternoon. 3 weeks later, Matthew had asked if she wanted to join him for a reading at the town's independent bookstore. It wasn't a date, not exactly, but it was an invitation. A door slightly ajar, and she didn't walk through it. She told him she had other plans. She didn't. She went home, watched the sea grow dark, and reread old emails from David. Theo. Next week, Matthew left for another city. She never saw him again. She had chosen familiarity over possibility. And the moment she realized it, something inside her had quietly closed. Now, writing to that younger self, Claire didn't scold her. She just whispered through the ink. You were scared. I know, but next time I hope you walk through the open door. She looked up. The rain had stopped, but its rhythm still echoed in her chest. Her fingers traced the edge of the page. One more sentence wanted to be written. One truth she had never dared say aloud, even now. She wrote it down anyway. You stayed when every sign said go. And as she wrote that line, she felt it, a shift, as if some buried part of her had finally exhaled. Claire didn't stop at one letter. Something had been unlocked inside her, the kind of release that doesn't feel like triumph, but like breathing after holding it too long. The drawer that once jammed now slid open like a wound finally naming itself. Inside were scraps of paper, ticket stubs, a photograph torn at the edge. She began choosing them, one by one, as if piecing together the outline of a woman she used to be but never truly knew. On a Tuesday morning, after shelving returned, books at the library, Claire found herself drawn to the back room where nobody went unless they were looking for lost umbrellas or forgotten coats. There, tucked behind a dusty file cabinet, was the corkboard from the summer reading program 12 years ago. The one Lena had joined at age 14. The one where Claire had written a note in blue ink. For every book you finish, I'll tell you something I've never said out loud. Lena had read 17 books that summer. Claire had told her 4 truths. That memory pressed itself into her chest now, not with guilt, but with a kind of loving ache. Back then, she'd believed. Parenting was about strength, about never showing the child your cracks. She hadn't known that sometimes, showing the cracks was what made a child feel safest. Back home, Claire began organizing the letters she had written but never sent. Some had no names, just years scribbled in the corner: 2007, 2011, 2016. There was one from 2004 with a dried daisy taped to it. Another that smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. One she recognized instantly was folded into a children's drawing. Lena's attempt at a mother-daughter portrait, drawn in thick crayon lines. Claire with brown hair, a book in one hand, and no mouth. It stunned her more than any words could. She had kept that picture in her wallet for 2 years. But she had never asked her daughter why she drew her silent. Later that night, as the wind picked up, Claire made tea but didn't drink it. She sat at her desk again, opened a new sheet, and began writing what she had never written before, not just to the girl she used to be, but to the woman she had become in trying to survive her. "You weren't weak for loving him," she wrote. "But you were mistaken in thinking that love could fix what someone else refused to face." She placed the drawing beside the letter and stared at it like a mirror. How many years had she gone on being that woman? Loved, perhaps, admired even, but never truly known. How many dinners had she cooked with tired hands and a painted-on smile, conversations peppered with polite nods, never saying what she actually meant? There were years like that, years where silence had been her armor and performance, her way of keeping the world from asking too much. But it had cost her something no one else could see: the sound of her own voice. Claire remembered a winter, when David had been away on a work trip. A snowstorm hit the coast, power went out for 16 hours, and the house turned impossibly still. She'd sat on the living room floor wrapped in 3 blankets, a single candle flickering beside her. And she had spoken, aloud, to no one. "I miss feeling like I matter." It was the first time she'd said it. The words had come like breath she hadn't known she was holding, and the moment they escaped, she'd felt ridiculous. She blew out the candle and went to bed. Now, decades later, she realized that voice, that honest, fragile, trembling voice, had been her truest one. She found herself writing letters not just to the girl she was, but to the men she had loved, in fragments. To her mother, who taught her that resilience often came disguised as silence. To the friend she ghosted after the divorce, simply because she didn't know how to ask for company without explaining why she needed it. Each letter, no matter how gentle, carved out something from the inside. But it didn't hurt. Not in the way grief used to. It felt more like making space, like removing furniture in a room you finally want to live in. On the 3rd night, Claire received a call from Lena. "Hi, Mom. Weird question. Do you remember that summer when I read all those books?" Claire smiled. 17 of them. I remember." Lena hesitated. "You only told me 4 things, but you wrote on the board you'd tell me something new each time. I always wondered why you stopped." Claire swallowed. "Because I was afraid you'd see too much." There was a pause, then softly, "I think I would have loved you even more." Claire didn't reply. She just closed her eyes and let the warmth of those words settle in places that had gone cold long ago. Later, after the call, she sat down and wrote her daughter a letter, not to be mailed, not yet. But she folded it neatly, placed it in the box, and added a small note. To be read when you're ready to forgive me for being more afraid than honest. The letters began to change. At first, they were simply memories, lovingly preserved and gingerly unfolded. But by the end of the first week, Claire found herself writing not only about what had happened, but about what didn't. The near confessions, the nearly spoken truths, the moments she almost chose differently. There was one memory that returned insistently, like a tide refusing to recede. It was spring of 2009. Claire had been volunteering at the town's community center on Tuesday nights. Lena was in high school, and David, already more ghost than husband, had been working late again. That evening, Claire had missed her ride and decided to walk home. It was still light out, the air soft and kind, the kind of evening that makes you believe something good might still happen. And then she saw him, Matthew, the same man from the bookstore reading she had once turned down. He was at the outdoor cafe across the street, seated alone, coffee in hand, a book open but unread. His eyes had found hers before she could pretend not to see him. He had smiled, not wide, not eager, just enough to say, I still remember. She had crossed the street. They spoke for exactly 7 minutes. He told her he was back visiting his mother, helping her pack up the old family house. She asked if he still wrote poetry. He didn't answer, only gave her a look that held both nostalgia and restraint. There was a pause, the kind that lives on the edge of invitation. I used to think about you, he said gently. That night, the one you didn't come. Claire had looked away. I had something else. Yeah, he replied after a beat. I figured. And then quietly, almost like an afterthought, I hope it was worth it. She hadn't known how to answer. She still didn't. In the letter she wrote that night, now so many years later, she didn't explain. She simply wrote, It wasn't. The rain returned on the 8th day. Claire didn't mind. She wrote through it, letting its rhythm steady her breath. She was running out of letters to write, but not out of truths. One of the last letters she attempted was to her 25-year-old self, again. But this time she didn't start with apology. She began with a question. What if we stopped blaming ourselves for needing love? She imagined that younger version of her, dressed in soft cotton, mascara smudged from hope that had stayed out too late, standing by the window waiting for someone who never knocked. She wanted to reach through time, brush the hair from that girl's face and say, You were always enough, even when no one told you. And then she wrote a line that cracked something open. You forgave everyone, but never once forgave yourself. The words sat on the page, trembling. Claire put down the pen, walked to the kitchen, turned off the kettle again, always boiling, never poured. She opened the cupboard and pulled out the last tea tin her mother had gifted her, chamomile and orange peel. Her mother had once said it was a tea for letting go. Claire let it steep, watching the color bloom like something returning to life. And when she sat back down, she wrote the final line of that letter. This is me, letting go, not of you, but of the woman I thought I had to be in order to survive you. The letter, to her 25-year-old self, didn't end there. Once Claire started letting the truth in, it didn't ask for permission anymore. It simply came. She wrote about the time she skipped an interview for a dream job in Portland because David had forgotten his keys and needed her to wait at home. He hadn't said thank you. She hadn't asked for one. At 25, she thought love meant prioritizing someone else's chaos over her own beginnings. You traded your voice for someone else's comfort, she wrote. And I understand why. You thought that's what good women did. But good women bleed too. The rain outside was steady now, not loud but constant, like a presence that refused to be ignored. Claire welcomed it. It made the silence inside feel less alone. Her phone buzzed, an email notification from Lena. Subject line: Old photos. She opened it and found an attachment. It was a scanned copy of a picture Claire had forgotten even existed. Her, holding 3-year-old Lena on her hip, both in raincoats, both laughing in front of a carousel. But what stopped her wasn't the image. It was the note Lena had typed below. "You always looked happiest when it was just us." Claire stared at the screen for a long time. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. For the first time, she could remember that day without bitterness. That was the day David had canceled last minute, again, and they'd gone without him. She remembered how the carousel music had almost drowned out Lena's laughter. Almost. She went to the drawer and pulled out a different kind of letter. Not one she had written, but one she had kept. It was a note from David, torn from a legal pad. Just one line: "Don't wait up. No date, no name. Just absence," scribbled. She had folded it neatly and tucked it into her journal back then, not because it meant anything, but because it was the only thing he left behind that week. Claire held the note now, unfolding it again. Not to read it. Just to feel the weight of how little it had ever meant. And then, calmly, she tore it in half. Then again, and once more. She placed the pieces in the fireplace but didn't light a flame. She didn't need spectacle. Letting go doesn't always need to burn. Instead, she picked up her pen and began her final letter of the night, not to a person, but to a feeling. "To the woman I tried so hard to become," she wrote, "you were strong. You were composed. You were always fine, but you weren't me." The letter stretched on, gentle but unsparing. She wrote about the weddings she went to alone, the anniversaries she pretended not to remember, the years she called resilience what was, in truth, exhaustion dressed up in kindness. She wrote about how hard it was to admit she had needed love, not wanted, not desired, but needed, and how she had hated herself for that need. How she had tried to be everything, anything, except vulnerable. She ended with one line: "Next time someone asks how I'm doing, I'll try not to answer fine, unless I really mean it." She folded that letter, not into the box, but into her wallet, replacing the old drawing Lena had once made. A small, quiet change. But this time, the mother in the picture had a mouth. Some truths do not come with thunder. They arrive as quiet visitors, late at night, wearing the clothes of old memories and smelling faintly of rain. Claire didn't expect it, this particular memory, to show up that evening. It wasn't one she had locked away. It wasn't even one she had told herself to forget. It had simply gone quiet. It began with the sound of a voicemail. She had been going through an old phone, long dead, but kept in a drawer filled with faded chargers, expired loyalty cards, and foreign coins that still smelled of a weekend in Lisbon. It took her 20 minutes to find the right cable, and another 10 to convince the battery to wake up. But eventually, the screen flickered to life, tired and pale, like someone just waking from a long sleep. There were only 4 voicemails. 3. From Lena, age 10, giggling, telling her mom she'd made a pancake shaped like a dog. "He has one ear," the tiny voice said proudly. Claire had smiled through tears. She remembered that morning. David wasn't home. And then there was the 4th. Just one from him. Not the angry, dismissive David she had grown used to in later years. This voice was from an earlier time, before the silences became weapons, when she still believed that love could be translated through patience. She hesitated, finger hovering over play. She wasn't sure what she feared more. Hearing something that hurt, or hearing something that proved she had misunderstood. She pressed it. "Hey," he said. "I know you're probably asleep. Just wanted to say I'm sorry I didn't make it tonight. You looked beautiful in that dress. I'll explain later. Okay. Good night." That was it. Just over 10 seconds long. She remembered the night instantly. Her 33rd birthday. The navy blue dress with the open back. The new heels she'd bought with her credit card. The dinner reservation at Paloma's, where she had sat alone for 43 minutes before folding the napkin into a perfect square and asking for the check. She had thrown the dress in the laundry the next morning, told Lena she had a wonderful night, and never mentioned it again. She had never listened to the voicemail, until now. She stared at the screen, played it again. The words were simple, too simple. They didn't explain anything. They didn't make her less alone that night. But there was a tremble in his voice, just a flicker, when he said beautiful, and something inside her shifted. She had built her strength on the idea that she had been entirely unloved, that she was the one left behind, discarded, forgotten. It had been easier to carry anger than confusion, simpler to turn pain into clarity. But this complicated things, because maybe he had loved her, not in the way she needed, not enough, but a little, enough to make a phone call, to try, poorly, too late, to reach her. And that little bit of love, that half-hearted echo, was somehow more devastating than no love at all. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the phone still in her lap, her hand against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The room was quiet except for the steady breath of the sea wind brushing against the window pane. She didn't cry, not in the way she used to, loud and collapsing. These tears came differently, not in waves, but in drops. The kind that don't ask for permission. And she didn't cry for David. She cried for the girl in the navy dress, the woman who sat at the restaurant table, watching the door open and close, pretending to check her phone, pretending not to notice when the waiter offered her a pitying smile. She cried for the woman who went home and scrubbed off her lipstick with shaking hands, who told herself she was fine, who never once listened to that voicemail because deep down, she didn't want to give him a chance to be forgiven. Because what would that mean? If he had loved her, even a little. Then, maybe she had stayed not because she was foolish, but because she'd seen something real, something worth staying for. And if that were true, then she wasn't just a victim of someone else's absence. She was also the architect of her own silence. She reached for her pen, opened a new page in her journal, and wrote a single sentence. No date, no signature. You were never unloved, just unseen. The difference was everything. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with the lights off, the phone beside her like a small, glowing witness to all the years she had tried to erase. The line kept playing in her head. You were never unloved, just unseen. It lingered not as comfort, but as clarity. The kind that doesn't warm you, but finally stops the spinning. At 3:17 a.m., she rose and went back to the desk. She didn't turn on music, didn't make tea, didn't need the ritual. This wasn't writing for memory. It was writing for reckoning. I spent years trying to become the kind of woman who could be loved, she began. Polished, quiet, accommodating. I said yes when I meant no, and smiled so often I forgot what my real mouth felt like. But the truth is, I was already lovable. You just weren't capable. She paused, let the words hang there, then, more slowly. And I punished myself for your limits. She sat back in her chair, letting the rawness of that line settle. How many times had she made herself smaller to fit someone else's discomfort? How many times had she made herself easy to keep instead of brave enough to lose? She thought of a night just a few years ago, long after the marriage had dissolved, long after Lena had moved out, when she'd stood in the bathroom holding a dress she hadn't worn in over a decade. the same navy one. It had still fit, mostly. She remembered turning in the mirror, trying to find the woman who used to live inside it. But all she could see was the distance between then and now. And then, she had done something she never told anyone about. She whispered out loud, "I miss you." To herself, not to David, not to anyone who had left, but to the version of Claire who used to believe in mornings and sunlit kitchens and music while cooking and loving without strategy. To the girl who wore red lipstick even when it wasn't date night. To the one who laughed before she calculated how it would land. She missed her. And now, sitting alone with the moonlight falling like silk across the desk, she realized she didn't need to miss that girl anymore. She could bring her back, maybe not fully, maybe not easily, but gently, day by day, choice by choice. She picked up the letter she had written earlier, the one to her 25-year-old self, and added something to the bottom in smaller handwriting, like a footnote you only dare whisper. You didn't ruin anything. You just believed too much in someone who never truly saw the gold in you. But you were never broken, just buried. And then finally, she wrote the sentence she never thought she'd be ready to write. I forgive you. Not David, not her mother, not anyone who hurt her, herself. That was the forgiveness that mattered most. The one that could untie years of knots without needing anyone else to hold the other end of the string. She folded the letter slowly, like it was something sacred. She didn't place it in the old tin box. She didn't lock it away. She left it open, on the desk. Tomorrow, she would walk to the post office and mail it, to her old address, to the girl who once waited at the door for a love that never came. She knew it wouldn't arrive. That house had new tenants. But still, something about the act felt real, necessary. A ceremony for a soul once left unanswered. And when she stood up from the desk, something inside her stood with her. Claire stood by the window as dawn peeled itself quietly over the horizon, the sea slowly revealing its color. The room still, held the scent of ink and quiet, a kind of stillness that felt earned. She watched the first boat cut across the gray water, a single line of movement in an otherwise undisturbed world. There was something oddly comforting about it, about the way it simply moved forward, not asking if it was too late to begin again. Her mind drifted to a memory she had buried too deep. The morning after she first left David, she had packed only 2 bags, left a note, not for him, but for Lena. It read, "Your mother is learning how to live out loud." At the time, it had felt bold. Now she saw it for what it was, a beginning written in tentative strokes. But beginnings don't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes they're quiet and uncelebrated, like the way she started sleeping on the left side of the bed because it faced the window, or how she began brushing her hair again before going to sleep, not for anyone to see, but because it made her feel soft in a world that had asked her to be hard for so long. She remembered attending a wedding alone that same year. Everyone had assumed she'd come with someone. One woman even said, "You're so brave to show up like this." Claire had smiled politely, but inside she had thought, why is loving myself in public an act of bravery? This morning, as light spilled across the floor, she felt something rare, stillness without ache. She opened her email and wrote a message to Lena. Not heavy, not filled with overdue confessions. Just a line. One day, I want to tell you the story of the woman I became. Because of you. She hit send. And with that, Claire turned back to the desk, looked at the letter left open, and whispered, almost without sound, I'm still here. And this time, I'm not disappearing. It had become a strange sort of ritual, sitting in the same kitchen chair at 7:45 every evening, with a cup of tea gone lukewarm, staring not at the letter anymore, but at the space around it. Claire didn't know when the letter had stopped, being the center, and when the silence had taken its place. But here she was once again, letting the day fall around her, letting the night come in through the windows without turning on the lights, letting memory fill in the dark like fog rising. Slowly across the floor, she hadn't written anything new since the letter to her younger self. Not for lack of trying. There were torn pages in the bin, ink stains on her fingers, a dozen drafts of sentences that started with, "I should have," and ended in nothing. But nothing she put down could contain the weight of what pressed in on her chest each time she passed a mirror, or made a list, or reached for a second mug that no longer had a use. It wasn't grief in the conventional sense. David had left, yes, but she had long since grieved the marriage, the man, the years. She poured into someone who gave her silence in return. It wasn't even the loss of time that haunted her now. It was something quieter, something colder. It was the realization that she had been absent from her own life, present in action, but not in presence. She had shown up, everywhere, for Lena, for David, for work, for neighbors. She had remembered birthdays, made lists, packed lunches, bought gifts that meant something. But she hadn't been there for herself. Not when it mattered. Not when the house went quiet. Not when the tears came and she told herself to be strong. Instead, there was a specific night she remembered more clearly than others, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it didn't. Lena was 16. Claire had made spaghetti. David wasn't home, as usual. Lena had eaten quickly, then disappeared upstairs with music playing from her phone. Claire had sat there alone at the table, staring at the candle she lit more from habit than desire, and felt nothing. Not loneliness, not sadness, not even anger. Nothing. She washed the dishes slowly, one by one, dried them with the towel that had begun to fray at the corners, turned off the light, and went to bed. She didn't cry. She didn't even sigh. And somehow that terrified her more than anything else. Not the pain, but the numbness. The way life could continue without her fully in it. The way days turned to months without her making a single choice that was hers and hers alone. That was the real loss. Not the man. Not the marriage, but the erosion of self, one small choice at a time. She had always thought strength meant holding it together. Keeping the kitchen clean, answering texts on time, remembering the names of her neighbors' dogs, smiling through parent-teacher meetings, office birthdays, funerals. She had worn strength like a well-pressed blouse, ironed smooth, tucked in neatly, never allowed to wrinkle in front of anyone else. But now, in the stillness of her home, Claire began to understand that real strength might have been the thing she never allowed herself to try. Breaking. Not breaking down in public, not falling apart in front of someone to elicit sympathy, but the quiet breaking, the kind that happened late at night when no one was watching, when the armor didn't make sense anymore, when the image of composure stopped feeling like pride and started feeling like exile. She walked into the bedroom, not with any plan, just pulled by something she couldn't name. The bed was made, the same way she always left it. A book lay untouched on the nightstand. She sat on the edge and reached for the drawer. Inside, there was a box she hadn't opened in years, a small wooden one with a delicate brass clasp and a floral pattern on the lid that was now fading with time. Inside the box were relics, old photographs, a folded piece of tissue from her wedding bouquet, a drawing Lena made at 5, 2 smiling stick figures labeled Mommy and Me, with hearts floating above their heads. A receipt from a dinner in 2002. David had taken her out after a long week and told her, "You're my person." She had believed him. She stared at the receipt. It was yellowed and curled at the edges. The ink was fading, but the date was still visible. She traced it with her finger. That had been the last time he made her feel chosen, and she remembered, with aching clarity, what she had worn that night, A red scarf she had saved up for. She had laughed too loudly. She had touched his arm without thinking. She had felt hopeful. She closed the box, not angrily, not dramatically, but like someone who finally realized the objects inside could no longer hold the version of herself she had tried to keep alive. She didn't cry. Instead, she went to the mirror. It was an old mirror, with a tiny crack in the bay, corner that caught the light in unexpected ways. She looked at her reflection, not with scrutiny, not with nostalgia, but with something closer to honesty. Her hair had thinned slightly. The lines around her eyes had deepened. Her shoulders had rounded just a little, from years of holding everything and everyone together. But her eyes, they were still hers. Just quieter. She stared into them and said, out loud, to the woman looking back, "I wasn't just tired. I was gone." And the moment the words were spoken, the weight of it settled in her chest like something that had finally come home. It wasn't shame. It wasn't failure. It was recognition. And that was where the healing would begin. The morning after, Claire admitted the hardest truth. I wasn't just tired. I was gone. There was no miraculous shift, no symbolic sunrise bathing the kitchen in golden light. The world looked the same, the soft gray of coastal winter, the sound of the sea brushing against rock and shore, the smell of leftover chamomile tea on the kitchen counter. But something had changed. Not around her, but within. There was a pause. Inside her, a space where shame had once been. And in that space, something unexpected began to stir. A readiness, not for redemption, not even for clarity, just a readiness to see everything as it truly was. She moved slowly through the house. That morning, every object seemed to hold a memory now. The chipped blue mug, her favorite, the faded scarf from her trip to Seattle, the book on the nightstand she had picked up and put down at least a dozen times. Her home had been her shelter for years, but it had also been a container, a quiet witness to her quiet vanishing. She hadn't cried again since the night before. She wasn't sure if she was past crying or if the tears had simply shifted shape, taking the form of breath, thought, motion. As she walked through the hallway to the front door, intending only to get the morning mail, something small and thin slipped from between the books on the middle shelf. At first, she didn't notice. It was the soft sound of paper hitting hardwood that pulled her back. She turned. A small envelope lay at her feet. No stamp, no name, yellowing at the edges. Claire picked it up carefully. Her fingers tingled, not from recognition, but from that strange sense the body has when something is about to matter. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery, slightly creased from time. Her breath caught as she recognized the handwriting. David. She hadn't seen his handwriting in years. The date in the top corner, January 14th, 2011. She sat down, unfolded it, and read, "Claire, I know I'm not what you need. I think I never was. But I want to say this anyway. You saved me in ways I'll never be able to explain. If I forget to show it, and I often do, it's not because I don't feel it. It's because I don't know how." She read it again, and again. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't beg her to return, or even promise anything. It was clumsy in the way that real regret often is. Unguarded, untrained, unsure of how much it should say. But in that uncertainty, something cracked open in Claire's chest. All these years, she had held on to a single narrative, that he never saw her, that he had walked through their marriage like a ghost through someone else's story, that she had been invisible in her own home, in her own body, in the space between his absence and her silence. But here, in a letter never sent, forgotten in a book neither of them probably remembered, was proof, imperfect, incomplete, that he had seen her. That she had mattered, even if only in fragments, and that fractured truth was somehow more powerful than the fantasy of perfect love she had long since let go of. She looked up from the letter and around the room. The sunlight through the window didn't change. The clock ticked forward, unmoved, but Claire felt herself soften, not into forgiveness, not yet, but into understanding, and that alone shifted the weight of everything she had carried. The town remained unchanged, as if it had been holding its breath all this time, waiting for her to return to herself. The corner cafe still brewed its bitter coffee, still served it with one too many napkins. The bookstore, with its creaky floors and slow chimes, still opened exactly 5 minutes later than its sign claimed. The world had continued without her, and that no longer made her feel forgotten. It made her feel free. Claire walked differently now. Not with purpose exactly, but with presence. She didn't rush through the streets the way she used to, always with a to-do list looping in her head, always trying to beat some invisible clock. These days, she noticed things. The dogwood tree that was finally in bloom. The elderly man who sat on the same bench each Tuesday morning, feeding breadcrumbs to birds who never quite came close. The way her body moved through space, not as something to hide, but something to inhabit. And maybe that was the difference. She had started living in her life, not around it. She didn't try to fill the silences anymore, not with music, not with chores, not even with words. The stillness that used to terrify her had become, in its own quiet way, a friend, a place to return to. Not because it asked nothing of her, but because it finally let her ask of herself. The box of letters remained on her desk, no longer a burden, but a part of the furniture of her becoming. She didn't open it every day. There was no ritual, no drama. Some evenings, she passed her hand over the lid without lifting it, like you might acknowledge an old friend you no longer need to explain yourself to. She had written one last letter, a short one. Not to David, not even to her past self, but to someone she was only beginning to understand, the woman she was now. She didn't sign it. She just wrote, "I'm proud of you for staying." Not staying in the marriage, not staying in pain, staying with herself. That line had cost her years, and now that she had earned it, she wore it like a gentle shield, close to the skin, invisible, but strong enough to hold her upright in rooms. That used to make her feel small. She saw Lena more often now. Not because they tried harder, but because they stopped trying at all. Their conversations had softened, loosened. They didn't talk about the past much, but there were moments, small ones, where healing slipped in without knocking. Like when Lena asked, "Mom, have you ever thought about traveling alone?" And Claire, instead of saying, "That's not really me," had paused and replied, "I might." Or when Lena sent her a photo of a painting from a gallery in Portland and wrote, "This reminded me of you, strong and still." There was no need for a reply. Some things didn't require words. Claire had begun painting in a quiet studio behind the library that smelled of turpentine and possibility. Her first strokes were hesitant. She had forgotten what it was like to want something without needing, to earn it. But with each week, each brush, something in her loosened. She didn't paint memories. She didn't paint grief. She painted light. Faint gold through trees. A cup on a windowsill. A pair of bare feet on tile, and in doing so, she began to see herself again. Not as a character in someone else's story, not as a memory softened by time, but as someone fully here, now, brush in hand, breath in chest, moment by moment, finding her way back. One late afternoon, as the sky turned that kind of dusty lavender it only did in April, Claire found herself walking the old path near the lighthouse. It wasn't a place she visited often. It had always been associated with a version of her that waited. Waited for David to show up. Waited for Lena to call. Waited for a sign that she hadn't been invisible all along. But now, she wasn't. Walking to remember. She was walking because her body wanted the air, because her legs felt strong, because her silence was no longer filled with tension, but with something closer to reverence. There was a bench halfway up the hill, and when she sat down, she didn't check her phone. She didn't rehearse anything. She simply closed her eyes and listened. The soft rustling of wind in the grass, the pull and hush of the tide, her own breathing, steady, like a song she'd once known by heart but forgotten the words to. She stayed there a long time. When she opened her eyes, she noticed someone had carved something small into the wood of the bench. It mattered, even if no one saw. She smiled, not because it was profound, but because it was true. Everything she had lived through, the quiet, the sorrow, the years of being small, the letters never sent, they had mattered. Not because they led to some grand revelation, not because they made her better, but because they were hers. And for once, that was enough. Later that week, she passed by the post office again. The watercolor class flyer was still on the board, but someone had written across the bottom in pen, "Full." She didn't feel disappointed. Instead, she walked down the street and bought herself a small sketchbook. Nothing fancy. Spiral-bound. 30 pages. The kind of thing a beginner might use. She brought it home and placed it beside her bed. That night, she wrote her name on the inside cover in small, careful script, not to claim it, but to begin. And one morning, weeks later, after the weather had turned warm and the light stayed longer than it used to, Claire did something she hadn't done in years. She took a photo. Not of the sea. Not of Lena. Not of anything she wanted to hold on to. She took a photo of herself, standing on the porch. No makeup, barefoot, sunlight falling across her face. She didn't smile, but her eyes were open in a way they hadn't been in a very long time. She didn't send the photo to anyone. She kept it, just for herself, because this version of her, the one who had stayed, who had grieved, who had written and burned and forgiven, not for others, but for her own breath. This version was the story worth keeping. And maybe, just maybe, when people asked about love, about loss, about late beginnings, she would say, "I learned how to stay with myself." And that was the beginning of everything. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, maybe take a quiet moment to subscribe, not for the updates, but for the chance to meet yourself again in the next story. There's more to come. More late loves. More letters never sent. More women who stayed too long and learned to stay finally for themselves. We'll be right here, waiting gently, like a bench by the sea.